What's up, my AP scholars? This is Unit 1 AP Biology Daily Videos Review. This is a university faculty lecture with me, NM, coming to you from my basement in Belmont, Massachusetts. The first topic of Unit 1, which is what makes Unit 1 my favorite, is all about water. I always tell my students the three threes of water. 3 drinks of water for 3 minutes every 3 mods. Speaking of which, I think it's time for one right now. Good water. Big idea number 1 for AP Biology is that structure determines function. And the first example of this is going to be for water. So water is a polar molecule, and this is because oxygen is more electronegative than hydrogen, so the oxygen hogs more of the electrons, and that creates partial charges, you might remember from chemistry. So water molecules are going to interact with hydrogen bonds due to this polarity, allowing for cohesion and adhesion. An example of cohesion, where water is bonding with other water molecules, is surface tension. You might remember from a lab with a penny, where we put droplets on the penny, and it kind of makes a mound, it doesn't spill over immediately, and that's because of the surface tension. An example of adhesion for water is capillary action, when water is bonding to some other molecule that's not water. And that's where, in capillary action, is where water is able to go up from the roots of a plant to the leaves without requiring energy. So water is, and capillary action also uses some cohesion to pull the water along too, but it's an example of both. So water is denser as a liquid than as a solid, so it floats, so ice floats, and that's really important for ecosystems in the water, so that during the winter when there's like ice on top of the sheet of ice, like the fish underneath are still able to swim. So also water is the heat of vaporization for water and its heat capacity exceptionally high, which makes sweating really efficient for maintaining homeostasis in temperature. And heat of vaporization heat capacity is basically saying that like water, it takes a lot of energy for it to become a gas and for it to like evaporate off of you. Um, so water is crucial for living organisms for everything we just talked about, but mainly because it's a universal solvent. So all of those reactions you're going to be learning about inside of the cell that happen in the cytosol, for example, those are all facilitated by water, and water plays a big role in reactions like dehydration, synthesis, and hydrolysis. The next topic is elements of life and macromolecules. So big idea number 2 is that organisms must exchange matter with the environment in order to grow and reproduce. So this is a product of the conservation of matter, in that like matter can't be destroyed or created. So when an organism wants to grow and reproduce, it has to get its matter from somewhere, some external source. And a lot of the matter we're going to be talking about in biology is the macromolecules. And the four that you need to know is carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, and nucleic acids. So carbohydrates are going to be made up of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. And then they take the form of monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides, where mono and disaccharides are simple sugars, and polysaccharides are going to be starches and fibers, which are chains of monosaccharides linked together. Lipids is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. So an example of it is triglycerides, which have polar and nonpolar ends. So the glycerol is going to be polar, whereas the fatty acid chains are going to be nonpolar, and that's going to lead to really important properties of it. Proteins are made of carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and sulfur. And so there's different levels of structure for proteins, but it all comes from amino acid, which have an amine group, a carboxyl group, and an R side chain. So they're also susceptible to denaturization. When we talk later about the different levels of structure, we'll talk more about how denaturization can affect them. Nucleic acids have carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphate. Some of the important structural terms you need to know is the phospho-sugar backbone, which is linked together by phosphodiester bonds. And the phospho-sugar backbone is basically the chain that runs on the side of like DNA or RNA, and it's going to be like a phosphate, a sugar, and then like it's going to keep on alternating. And that kind of like is like the structure of DNA and RNA. And linked to it from the sides, kind of like the rungs of a ladder, are the bases, and in the case of DNA, the base pairs. The next topic is the functions of carbohydrates and lipids. So big idea number 3 is that organisms need to store energy in chemical bonds. So carbs and lipids are the main ways they're going to be doing that. Since carbohydrates are used for short-term energy storage, like for example, the simple sugars, whereas lipids are usually going to be used for long-term energy storage. And they have a lot of energy because of their structure with the hydrogen and carbon chains, but it takes a lot to get that energy into something that the cell can use. Both carbs and lipids are used in the cell membrane for the cell signaling and cell communications. And lipids also help keep the cell warm and protected due to their structure. So the functions of proteins and nucleic acids. So the proteins have the different levels of structure that we talked about. There's going to be primary, secondary, tertiary, and quaternary. So primary structure is the polypeptide chain, which is the bonding of all those amino acids into a chain that has a very specific order that's going to matter for its structure, its structure and its function. The secondary level of structure is how the protein's actually going to fold. There's a few ways that those polypeptide chains can fold over, and that's going to make a difference for how it functions. The tertiary level of structure is how those R side chains are going to interact with each other, which is why the order of those amino acids is so important. And by the third level of structure, a protein is usually functional, but some proteins some proteins need to go to the quaternary structure, whereas which is when multiple polypeptide chains will come together to form bigger structures and that's when they'll become functional. Protein functioning. Some examples for this is ribosomes, enzymes, cell membrane, and structure. So proteins I usually like to think of as the workers of the cell, and they kind of do all the heavy lifting. So in cell membrane, you should know that they're all of those facilitated diffusions and stuff. That's going to be proteins going to be used for that. In the structure, it's like the cytoskeleton is made up of proteins. So nucleic acid functioning. The nucleic acids are used to store information to pass on to offspring. And this is really important when it comes to stuff like evolution and adaptation, because that's how evolution and adaptation are able to happen. People used to think it was through proteins, but when we discovered more about nucleic acids, we figured out that that's really what's going on. And then also the structure of these nucleic acids kind of shapes how evolution works and how mutations are able to happen and stuff like that. So closing off, I have some tips for the AP exam. I always recommend to skip chi-square analysis questions until the end because they're a really big pain and they're not worth it. Also, learning how to read an analog clock is probably pretty important depending on where you're taking the test, because I really struggled with the time management since I did not know what time it was at all. Also, using one pages to review is going to be really helpful. And make sure to listen to Organelles in Paris the night before the exam because it's an absolutely fire song. Okay, thank you for listening. Good luck on the test.